Elena Martinez stood in the ornate living room of the Kane mansion, her hands trembling as she clutched the marriage contract that would seal her fate. At 18, she should have been planning for college, dreaming of her future, and experiencing the freedom of young adulthood. Instead, she was about to become the wife of a man she had met only twice. Alexander Kane sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing financial documents with the same cold efficiency he applied to all his business dealing. At 32, he was already worth hundreds of millions, having built his empire through ruthless determination and an unwavering focus on profit. To him, this marriage was simply another strategic acquisition. Elena's father, Miguel Martinez, had once been Alexander's business partner until a series of poor investments and market downturns had left him drowning in debt. The marriage arrangement was Alexander's solution, Elena's hand in exchange for absorbing Miguel's debts and saving the Martinez family from complete financial ruin. "The terms are straightforward," Alexander said without looking up from his papers. "You will live in my home, attend social functions as my wife, and maintain the appearance of a proper marriage. In return, your family's debts will be forgiven, and they will receive a monthly allowance sufficient for comfortable living." Elena's mother, Carmen, squeezed her daughter's shoulder with tears in her. "Mija, I'm so sorry it has come to this. If there were any other way." "There isn't," Miguel said firmly, though his voice carried the weight of a man who had failed his family. "This is the only option that keeps us from losing everything." Elena looked at Alexander, studying his sharp features and cold gray eyes. He was undeniably handsome, with dark hair, and the kind of presence that commanded attention, but there was no warmth in his expression, no indication that he saw her as anything more than a business asset. "What about love?" Elena asked quietly, her voice barely audible in the vast room. Alexander finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers with an expression of mild surprise, as if the question had never occurred to him. "Love is a luxury neither of us can afford. This is a practical arrangement that benefits both our family." Chapter 2. The Wedding. The wedding ceremony took place in the Kane family's private chapel, a cold and sterile affair that felt more like a corporate merger than a celebration of love. Elena wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her petite frame, while Alexander stood at the altar in an expensive black tuxedo, checking his watch as if he had more important places to be. Only immediate family members attended, along with a handful of Alexander's business associates, who viewed the event as a networking opportunity. There were no friends Elena's age, no bridesmaids giggling with excitement, no sense of joy or anticipation that should have marked the beginning of. As Elena walked down the aisle, she caught glimpses of Alexander's family members whispering among themselves. His mother, Victoria Kane, watched with obvious disapproval, having made it clear that she considered Elena an unsuitable match for her son. His younger sister, Sophia, looked sympathetic, but said nothing that might challenge Alexander's decision. The ceremony itself was brief and perfunctory. Alexander recited his vows with the same tone he might use to read a quarterly earnings report, while Elena struggled to keep her voice steady, as she promised to love and honor a man who had already made it clear that such emotions were irrelevant to their arrangement. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander's kiss was polite but passionless, lasting exactly long enough to satisfy the legal requirements of the ceremony. Elena felt nothing but the cold touch of his lips and the weight of the gold band now encircling her finger. The reception was held in the mansion's ballroom, where guests made polite conversation about business and politics, while Elena sat at the head table feeling like a stranger at her own wedding. Alexander spent most of the evening networking with his associates, occasionally returning to her side when protocol demanded. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kane," said one of Alexander's business partners, a man whose name Elena had already forgotten. "You've married one of the most successful men in the country." Elena smiled politely, but inside she felt hollow. Success, she was learning, could be measured in many different ways, and wealth was proving to be a poor substitute for happiness. Chapter 3. The Cold Reality. Elena's new life in the Kane mansion was one of luxury and loneliness. She had her own suite of rooms, complete with a sitting area, walk-in closet, and marble bathroom that was larger than her childhood bedroom. But despite the opulent surroundings, she felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage. Alexander maintained a strict schedule that rarely included his new wife. He left for the office before dawn and often didn't return until well after dinner. When he was home, he spent his time in his private study, handling business calls and reviewing contracts. Their interactions were limited to polite exchanges about household matters and social obligations. "Mrs. Kane," the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, would say each morning, "Mr. Kane has left instructions for your schedule. You have a fitting with the personal shopper at 10, followed by lunch with the charity committee at noon." Elena's days were filled with activities designed to mold her into the perfect society wife. She attended etiquette classes, learned about wine and art appreciation, and was tutored in the social graces expected of someone in her position. But none of these activities felt authentic to who she really was. The personal shopper, a stern woman named Margaret, replaced Elena's modest wardrobe with designer clothes that cost more than her family's monthly income. Mr. Kane has very specific expectations about how his wife should present herself, Margaret explained while selecting a cocktail dress that Elena found uncomfortably. Elena's attempts to connect with Alexander were met with polite but firm resistance. When she suggested they have dinner together, he explained that his schedule didn't permit such luxury. When she asked about his work, he gave vague responses that made it clear he didn't consider her capable of understanding business matters. The most painful moments came during the social events they attended together. Alexander would place his hand on her back or take her arm in public, playing the role of the attentive husband. But Elena could feel the performance in his touch, the way he would immediately distance himself the moment they were out of public view. At night, Elena would lie in her bed, listening to the sounds of Alexander moving around in his separate bedroom, wondering if this cold coexistence was all their marriage would ever be. Chapter 4. Seeking Connection. As months passed, Elena made increasingly desperate attempts to bridge the emotional distance between herself and Alexander. She studied his business interests, hoping to engage him in meaningful conversation about his work. She learned to cook his favorite meals, thinking that perhaps sharing a home-cooked dinner might soften his demeanor. "I made your favorite tonight," Elena said one evening when Alexander returned from the office, gesturing toward the dining room where she had set the table with candles and his preferred wine. Alexander glanced toward the dining room, then checked his watch. "I have a conference call with Tokyo in 20 minutes. Mrs. Chen can prepare a plate for me to take to my study." Elena's face fell, but she tried to hide her disappointment. "Perhaps tomorrow night? I'll be in Chicago tomorrow," Alexander replied, already heading toward his study. "The Peterson merger requires my personal attention." Elena began volunteering with local charities, partly to fill her empty days and partly hoping that Alexander might appreciate her efforts to contribute meaningfully to their community. She worked with literacy programs for underprivileged children and helped organize fundraising events for the local hospital. "You've raised more money for the children's wing than any volunteer in our history," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's director of development. "You have a real gift for connecting with people and inspiring them to give." When Elena shared this accomplishment with Alexander, he nodded approvingly, but seemed more interested in the networking opportunities her charity work might provide. "The hospital board includes several potential investors," he noted. "Make sure to mention my interest in their upcoming capital campaign." Elena also tried to learn about Alexander's childhood and family history, hoping to understand what had made him so emotionally distant. But his responses were always brief and factual, revealing nothing about his inner thoughts or feelings. "Your sister Sophia seems lovely," Elena said after a family dinner. "She mentioned that you used to be very close when you were children." "Sophia has always been sentimental," Alexander replied dismissively. "Childhood relationships are irrelevant to adult responsibilities." Elena began to realize that Alexander's emotional walls weren't just directed at her. They seemed to encompass everyone in his life, including his own family members. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. 2 years into their marriage, Elena discovered she was pregnant. For the first time since their wedding, she felt a spark of hope that this news might finally create a real connection between herself and Alexander. She imagined him softening the thought of becoming a father, perhaps finally allowing her to see the man behind the cold businessman facade. Elena planned the announcement carefully, preparing Alexander's favorite dinner and choosing a quiet evening when he didn't have any scheduled calls or meeting. She waited until they were both seated at the dining table before sharing the "Alexander, I have something important to tell you," she began, her heart racing with nervous excitement. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." Alexander set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. For a moment, Elena thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise, perhaps even pleasure. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by his usual composed demeanor. "I see," he said finally. "Have you seen a doctor to confirm the pregnancy?" "Yes. Dr. Martinez confirmed it yesterday. I'm about 8 weeks along." Alexander nodded and returned to his meal. "We'll need to hire additional household staff, a nanny certainly, and perhaps a nurse for the first few months. I'll have my assistant research the best agencies." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "That's all you have to say? We're having a child together, our child." "I understand the biological facts," Alexander replied calmly. "The child will be well cared for and will want for nothing. I'll ensure they receive the best education and every advantage my resources can provide." "What about love?" Elena asked, her voice breaking. "What about being a family?" Alexander's expression hardened. "I've already explained my position on such matters. This child will benefit from stability and financial security, which are far more valuable than sentimental notions." That night, Elena lay in bed with her hand on her still flat stomach, tears streaming down her face, as she realized that even the prospect of becoming parents wouldn't change the fundamental nature of their relationship. Alexander saw their unborn child as another asset to be managed, not a miracle to be celebrated. 3 weeks later, Elena lost the baby. The miscarriage was devastating, made worse by Alexander's clinical response to the loss. "These things happen," he said when she told him through her tears. "The doctor says there's no reason we can't try again when you're ready." Chapter 6. The Transformation. The loss of her baby marked a turning point in Elena's life. The grief and Alexander's cold response to their shared tragedy finally broke through the last of her illusions about their marriage. She realized that she had been trying to create love where none existed, hoping to change a man who had no interest in changing. Elena began to focus on herself for the first time since her marriage. She enrolled in business courses at the local university, using her charity work as a foundation to study nonprofit management and social entrepreneurship. The intellectual challenge invigorated her in ways she hadn't experienced since high school. "You have exceptional analytical skills," Professor David Chen told her after she presented a comprehensive plan for improving literacy rates in underserved communities. "Have you considered pursuing this professionally?" Elena had never thought of herself as capable of professional success, having been told repeatedly that her role was to support Alexander's career rather than develop her own. But her professors and classmates saw potential in her that she was only beginning to recognize in herself. She also began therapy with Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, a psychologist who specialized in helping women navigate difficult life transitions. Through their sessions, Elena began to understand that her worth wasn't determined by Alexander's approval or the success of their marriage. "You've been trying to earn love from someone who isn't capable of giving it," Dr. Rodriguez explained during one of their sessions. "But that doesn't mean you're unworthy of love. It means you've been looking for it in the wrong place." Elena started making friends outside of Alexander's social circle, fellow students, volunteers at the charities where she worked, and neighbors who knew her as Elena rather than Mrs. Kane. These relationships showed her what genuine connection and mutual respect looked like. Alexander seemed oblivious to the changes in his wife. He continued his routine of work and social obligations, treating Elena with the same polite indifference he had always shown. But Elena was no longer the naive 18-year-old who had desperately sought his approval. When Alexander announced that he would be traveling to Europe for 6 weeks on business, Elena felt relief rather than loneliness. For the first time in years, she would have space to breathe and think without the constant reminder of their failed marriage. Chapter 7. Finding her voice. During Alexander's absence, Elena experienced a freedom she hadn't felt since before her marriage. She spent her days attending classes, working on her thesis project about sustainable funding models for community development, and building relationships with people who valued her thoughts and opinions. "Your proposal for the literacy program is brilliant," said Maria Santos, the director of the community center where Elena had been volunteering. "We've been struggling with funding for years, but your approach could make us completely self-sustaining." Elena's confidence grew as she realized that her ideas had real value and could make a meaningful difference in people's lives. She began to envision a future where she could build something of her own, independent of Alexander's wealth and influence. When Alexander returned from Europe, he found a wife who was subtly but fundamentally different. Elena still fulfilled her social obligations and maintained the appearance of the perfect society wife, but there was a new strength in her demeanor that he couldn't quite identify. "You seem different," Alexander observed one evening as they prepared for a charity gala. "More confident." "I've been keeping busy while you were away," Elena replied, adjusting her earrings in the mirror. "My thesis project is going well, and the community center has asked me to consider a permanent position." Alexander frowned. "A position? Elena, you don't need to work. Your role is here, supporting my career and our social obligations." "Perhaps it's time my role expanded," Elena said quietly, meeting his eyes in the mirror. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their car, but Elena could sense Alexander's displeasure with her response. For the first time in their marriage, she had challenged his assumptions about her place in their relationship. At the gala, Elena found herself engaged in substantive conversations about social policy and community development, rather than the usual superficial small talk. Other attendees began to see her as more than just Alexander Kane's decorative wife. "Mrs. Kane, I had no idea you were so knowledgeable about urban planning," said Councilman Robert Hay. "We could use someone with your insights on the city's development." Elena felt a thrill of recognition and possibility. For the first time in years, she was being valued for her mind, rather than her appearance or her husband's wealth. Chapter 8. The Decision. Elena's growing independence created subtle but increasing tension in her marriage with Alexander. He began to notice that she was less available for his social function, more likely to express her own opinions during conversations, and generally less compliant with his expectations. "The Morrison dinner is next Thursday," Alexander informed her one morning. "It's an important business opportunity, so I need you to make a good impression on Mrs. Morrison." "I'm sorry, but I can't attend," Elena replied, not looking up from the grant proposal she was reviewing. "I have a presentation to the city council that evening about the literacy program funding." Alexander stared at her in surprise. "Cancel it. The Morrison dinner takes priority." Elena set down her papers and looked at him directly. "No, Alexander. This presentation is important to me, and I won't cancel it for a social function." "Elena, I think you're forgetting your responsibilities as my wife, and I think you're forgetting that I'm a person with my own goals and commitments," Elena replied calmly. "You'll have to attend the Morrison dinner alone." The argument that followed was the most honest conversation they had shared in years. Alexander accused Elena of being selfish and ungrateful, while Elena finally voiced her frustration with their emotionally barren marriage. "I've spent 4 years trying to be the wife you wanted," Elena said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her. "But I can't spend the rest of my life being invisible in my own marriage. This is what we agreed to," Alexander replied coldly. "A practical arrangement that benefits both our families." "I was 18 and had no choice," Elena shot back. "But I'm not that powerless girl anymore." That night, Elena made a decision that had been building for months. She couldn't continue living in a marriage that offered her no emotional fulfillment or personal growth. She had discovered her own worth and potential, and she refused to sacrifice them for the sake of maintaining appearances. Elena began quietly making preparations to leave. She opened her own bank account, researched apartments she could afford on her anticipated salary from the community center, and consulted with a lawyer about divorce proceedings. The hardest part was telling her parents, who had sacrificed so much and depended on the financial security her marriage provided. "Mija, are you sure about this?" her mother asked, tears in her eyes. "Marriage requires compromise and patience." "I've been patient for 4 years, Mama," Elena replied, "but I can't compromise away my entire identity." Chapter 9. The Departure. Elena chose to leave on a Tuesday morning while Alexander was in meetings downtown. She had packed only her personal belongings and a few items of sentimental value, leaving behind the designer clothes and expensive jewelry that had never felt like they truly belonged to her. Mrs. Chen found the letter Elena had left on Alexander's desk, along with her wedding ring and house key. The letter was brief and dignified, explaining that she could no longer continue in a marriage that offered no possibility for genuine partnership or emotional connection. "I'm grateful for the financial security you provided my family," Elena had written. "But I've realized that I need more than security to build a meaningful life. I need to be valued for who I am, not just for the role I can play in someone else's story." Alexander's reaction to Elena's departure was swift and characteristically business. He had his lawyers draw up divorce papers that were generous in their financial terms but cold in their emotional. He seemed to view her leaving as a breach of contract rather than the end of a marriage. Elena moved into a modest apartment near the university and threw herself into her work with the community center. The transition was challenging. She had grown accustomed to luxury and had to learn to manage on a much smaller budget, but she felt more alive than she had in years. "You're glowing," Maria Santos observed during Elena's first week as the center's full-time program director. "I've never seen you look so happy." Elena's work flourished in ways that surprised even her. Her literacy program became a model for other communities, and her innovative funding strategies attracted attention from foundations and government agencies. Within a year, she had transformed a struggling community center into a thriving hub of educational and social services. Alexander, meanwhile, continued his life much as before, attending social functions alone and focusing on his business empire. To outside observers, he seemed unaffected by his wife's departure, maintaining his usual composed demeanor and professional success. But those closest to him began to notice subtle changes. His sister Sophia mentioned that he seemed more withdrawn than usual, and his business associates noted that he had become even more demanding and difficult to work with. "He's always been driven," his business partner James Morrison told his wife, "but lately he seems almost desperate, like he's trying to prove something to himself." Chapter 10. Separate Paths. For 3 years after their divorce, Elena and Alexander lived completely separate lives in the same city. Elena's career continued to flourish as she became a recognized expert in community development and social entrepreneurship. She was invited to speak at conferences, consulted on policy, and was featured in magazines as an example of successful women making a difference in their community. Elena also began dating again, slowly and carefully. She had learned to value herself and wasn't willing to settle for relationships that didn't offer genuine emotional connection and mutual respect. When she met Dr. James Patterson, a pediatrician who volunteered at her literacy program, she found herself experiencing the kind of partnership she had always dreamed of. "You light up when you talk about your work," James told her during one of their early dates. "It's beautiful to see someone so passionate about making a difference." Elena felt tears in her eyes, remembering how Alexander had dismissed her interests as irrelevant hobbies. With James, she felt valued and supported in ways she had never experienced before. Alexander, meanwhile, had thrown himself even deeper into his business venture. His company had expanded internationally, and his personal wealth had grown exponentially. He was featured on magazine covers as one of the country's most successful entrepreneurs, but those who knew him well noticed that his success seemed to bring him no joy. "He's like a machine," Sophia confided to their mother. "He works 18-hour days, never takes vacations, and I can't remember the last time I saw him smile. I think losing Elena affected him more than he's willing to admit." Victoria Kane, who had initially disapproved of Elena, found herself missing her former daughter-in-law's warmth and genuine kindness. "She brought something to this family that we didn't appreciate until it was gone," she admitted to Sophia. Alexander's few attempts at dating were unsuccessful. The women he met were either intimidated by his wealth and intensity, or interested only in his money and status. None of them challenged him intellectually or emotionally the way Elena had, though he refused to acknowledge this to himself. One evening, while working late in his office, Alexander found himself looking at a newspaper article about Elena's latest achievement, a national award for her innovative approach to community development. The photograph showed her accepting the award with a radiant smile, looking confident and fulfilled in ways he had never seen during their marriage. For the first time since their divorce, Alexander allowed himself to wonder if he had made a mistake. Chapter 11. The Reckoning. Alexander's moment of reckoning came when he suffered a minor heart attack at age 42. The stress of his relentless work schedule and emotional isolation had finally taken a physical toll, forcing him to confront the emptiness of his life outside of business success. During his recovery, Alexander had time to think in ways he had avoided for years. Lying in his hospital bed, he realized that despite all his wealth and professional achievements, he felt profoundly alone. He had no close relationships, no one who cared about him as a person rather than as a business asset. "You need to make some serious lifestyle changes," Dr. Williams told him during a follow-up appointment. "The stress levels you're maintaining aren't sustainable. You need to find ways to relax, to connect with people, to find meaning beyond work." Alexander began therapy reluctantly, initially viewing it as another task to complete for his health. But Dr. Michael Torres, his therapist, gradually helped him understand how his childhood experiences had shaped his adult relationships. "Your father taught you that emotions were weaknesses and that success was the only measure of worth," Dr. Torres, "but that philosophy has left you isolated and unable to form meaningful connections with others." Through months of difficult self-examination, Alexander began to understand how his treatment of Elena had been shaped by his own fears and limitations. He realized that her attempts to connect with him hadn't been weaknesses to be dismissed, but gifts he had been too damaged to accept. "I was cruel to her," Alexander admitted during one session, the words coming with great difficulty. "She tried to love me, and I treated her like she was naive for wanting emotional intimacy." "What would you say to her now, if you could?" Dr. Torres asked. Alexander was quiet for a long time before answering. "I would apologize. I would tell her that she deserved so much better than what I gave her, and I would thank her for trying to bring love into my life, even though I was too broken to receive it." As Alexander worked on understanding himself, he began to follow Elena's career from a distance. He read about her achievements, watched interviews she gave about her work, and felt a growing sense of pride mixed with regret. She had become the remarkable woman he had never allowed her to be during their. When Alexander learned that Elena was engaged to Dr. Patterson, he felt a pain that surprised him with its intensity. For the first time, he understood what he had lost. Chapter 12. Redemption. The opportunity for Alexander to face Elena came unexpectedly when a crisis at the community center threatened to shut down all of Elena's programs. A major funding source had been lost due to political changes, and the center needed emergency financial support to continue operating. Alexander learned about the situation through his business network and realized he had the power to help, but he also knew that any assistance from him would be complicated by their history. After much deliberation, he decided to approach Elena directly. Elena was working late in her office when Alexander appeared in her doorway, looking older and somehow more vulnerable than she remembered. She felt her heart skip a beat, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Hello, Alexander. What brings you here?" "I heard about your funding crisis," he said, stepping into her office. "I'd like to help." Elena studied his face, looking for signs of the calculating businessman she had once known. Instead, she saw something she had never seen before: genuine humility. "Why?" she asked simply. Alexander took a deep breath, and then did something that shocked Elena completely. He knelt down in front of her desk, his eyes filled with tears she had never seen him shed. "Because I owe you more than I can ever he said, his voice breaking. "Because you tried to love me when I didn't deserve it, and I was too damaged and afraid to love you back. Because you became an extraordinary woman despite my attempts to diminish you, not because of anything I did." Elena felt tears streaming down her own face as she looked at this man who had once seemed so cold and unreachable, now kneeling before her in complete emotional surrender. I don't expect forgiveness, Alexander. I don't expect anything, but I want you to know that losing you was the greatest mistake of my life, and watching you flourish has been both my greatest regret and my greatest joy. Elena stood and walked around her desk, placing her hand gently on Alexander's shoulder. Stand up, Alexander, please. When he rose, she looked into his eyes and saw the man she had always hoped existed beneath the cold exterior. I forgave you years ago, she said softly, not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying anger was holding me back from building the life I wanted. Alexander nodded, understanding that her forgiveness was a gift he didn't deserve but desperately needed. Your center will receive the funding it needs, he said. No strings attached, no recognition required. It's the least I can do. As Alexander turned to leave, Elena called his name. Alexander, I hope you find the happiness you're looking for. You deserve love too, even if you couldn't accept it. Watching him walk away, Elena felt a sense of closure and peace she hadn't expected. The scared 18-year-old girl who had married him was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned her own worth and built a life filled with purpose and genuine love. Alexander had learned too late what he had lost, but perhaps that understanding would help him become the man he was capable of being. Sometimes, Elena reflected, the greatest victories came not from revenge, but from the grace to forgive and the strength to move forward.